My name is Eduardo Williams, and at 72 years old, I never expected to be called a leech by anyone, let alone my own daughter-in-law. When Sarah shouted those words across our family dinner table last Thanksgiving, everyone froze except me. I burst out laughing. The $5 million I had quietly amassed over decades was my little secret, one she was about to discover the hard way. Before I continue this story, if you are watching from your comfortable couch right now, hit that like button. If you have ever had someone completely misjudge who you really are. I grew up in Oakfield, a small Midwestern town where everybody knew your business before you did. My father owned the only hardware store in town, a place where farmers, contractors, and weekend warriors alike would gather not just to buy tools, but to swap stories and advice. At 16, I started working there after school and on weekends. Dad paid me exactly what he paid other employees. No special treatment. "You earn your place in this world, Eddie," he would say, using my childhood nickname that nobody uses anymore. Nobody respects what comes easy. Those early years shaped everything about who I became. I learned how to greet customers by name, how to listen to what they needed rather than what they thought they wanted, and most importantly, how to solve problems with limited resources. Dad ran that store for 40 years without ever taking on debt. "If you can't afford it, you don't need it," was practically our family motto. I met Jennifer during my sophomore year of college. I was working 3 jobs to put myself through a business degree: morning shifts at a bakery, afternoon classes, and evening work as a campus security guard. Jennifer worked in the campus library, and I would often stop by during my security rounds, gradually working up the courage to talk to her. She was studying literature, with dreams of becoming a teacher. Unlike me, Jennifer came from a well-off family, but you would never know it from her modest way of living. That's what first attracted me to her, I think. In a time when many college girls were focused on finding a husband who could provide them with a comfortable life, Jennifer was determined to make her own way. We married the summer after graduation. Jennifer's parents offered to buy us a house as a wedding gift, but we declined. Instead, we rented a tiny apartment and saved every penny we could. Jennifer taught at the local high school, while I started working for a small construction company. Within 5 years, I had learned enough about the business to strike out on my own. Williams Contracting started small, just me and 2 other guys taking on residential renovation jobs. But we built a reputation for honest work at fair prices, and the business grew steadily. By our 10th anniversary, we had 20 employees and had expanded into commercial construction. Jennifer and I had 1 child, our son Thomas. We raised him with the same values that shaped us: hard work, honesty, living within your means, and finding joy in simple things. Even as the business became more successful, we continued to live modestly. We moved to a slightly larger house when Thomas was born, but nothing extravagant. We drove our cars until they wouldn't run anymore. We took 1 vacation each year, usually camping or renting a cabin by the lake. The company continued to grow throughout the 80s and 90s. By the time Thomas went to college, Williams Contracting had become one of the most respected construction firms in the state, with over 100 employees. We had money, more than I had ever dreamed of having as a young man. But Jennifer and I agreed that flaunting wealth did nothing but create distance between yourself and others. When Thomas graduated and moved away to pursue his own career in architecture, Jennifer and I discussed what to do with the business. I was approaching 60, still enjoyed the work, but was beginning to feel the physical toll of decades in construction. We decided I would start gradually stepping back, grooming my best project manager to take over eventually. Then Jennifer got sick. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed too late for effective treatment. The doctors gave her 6 months. She lived for 11, fighting every day with the same quiet determination she brought to everything in life. The night before she died, Jennifer made me promise 2 things: that I would find happiness again, and that I would help Thomas establish himself independently. "Don't make it too easy for him," she whispered, her voice weak but her mind still sharp. "But be there when he really needs you." After Jennifer passed, I threw myself into work for a while. But within a year, I knew it was time to fulfill our plan. I sold the company to my project manager for a fair price, below market value, but enough to secure my retirement and honor the decades of loyalty. The final number, $5 million. I invested it conservatively, living off the interest and continuing my simple lifestyle. For several years, I lived alone in the house Jennifer and I had shared for most of our marriage. I volunteered at the local homeless shelter, took cooking classes, traveled a bit. Thomas had married by then to a woman named Sarah, whom he had met in graduate school. They settled in Boston, where Thomas worked for a prestigious architecture firm while trying to build his own client base. I saw them a few times each year, flying out for holidays or important events. Sarah always struck me as somewhat cold, more concerned with appearances than substance. But Thomas seemed happy, and that was what mattered. I kept my financial situation private, not out of distrust, but from a lifelong habit of discretion. Besides, I wanted Thomas to make his own way, just as Jennifer and I had. 3 years ago, Thomas called with a proposition. He and Sarah had bought a house in the suburbs, a beautiful place, but stretching their finances thin. Would I consider selling my house and moving in with them? They had a finished basement that could be converted into a private apartment for me. Thomas framed it as a benefit for everyone. I wouldn't have to maintain a house alone as I aged. They would have help with their mortgage, and my grandson Lucas, then 4 years old, would get to grow up knowing his grandfather. It seemed like the right time for a change. I sold the house, gave half the proceeds to charity in Jennifer's name, and moved to Boston. At first, things went smoothly. I set up my space in the basement, which had its own small kitchen and bathroom. I spent mornings with Lucas before he went to preschool, giving Thomas and Sarah a chance to get to work early. I kept the yard maintained, did minor repairs around the house, and cooked dinner twice a week. Thomas seemed genuinely happy to have me there. We would often sit together in the evenings after Lucas was in bed, talking about his projects or reminiscing about Jennifer. But Sarah clearly saw me as an intrusion. She was polite enough when Thomas was around, but I could feel her resentment growing. What I didn't know then was how much their finances were already strained by Sarah's spending habits, or how much she would come to see me as a burden rather than help. Thomas had always been a thoughtful, hard-working kid. From elementary school through high school, he maintained excellent grades while participating in track and field. Unlike many of his friends' parents, Jennifer and I never had to nag him about homework or chores. He seemed to have internalized our values naturally, understanding from an early age that effort preceded reward. When Thomas announced he wanted to become an architect, I couldn't have been prouder. His meticulous attention to detail, creative thinking, and practical approach to problem-solving made him well-suited for the profession. Jennifer and I supported his college applications, and though we could have paid his tuition outright, we agreed on a different approach. We would cover half, and he would be responsible for the rest through scholarships, work-study, and summer jobs. Thomas never complained, understanding the value of having some skin in the game. It was during graduate school at MIT that Thomas met Sarah. She was studying interior design, with ambitions of working with high-end clients. From the first time Thomas brought her home to meet us, I sensed a fundamental difference in values. Where our family prized functionality and understated quality, Sarah was drawn to flashy brands and status symbols. She drove a luxury car that I later learned was leased, wore designer clothes, and frequently mentioned the influential people she hoped to work with. Jennifer was more diplomatic than I was, suggesting we give Sarah time to show more of her character. People grow toward or away from each other, she would say. Let's see which direction Thomas and Sarah take. I tried to keep an open mind, but I couldn't help noticing how Thomas's spending habits changed when he was with Sarah. Suddenly, expensive restaurants and weekend getaways became normal, things he had never prioritized before. After graduation, Thomas landed a position at BKT Architects, a respected firm in Boston. Sarah struggled to find permanent work in her field, taking on freelance projects while networking extensively. They married a year later, with an elaborate wedding that I later discovered Thomas had put on credit cards. Jennifer was already sick by then, unable to travel for the ceremony. I went alone, putting on a brave face, while inwardly concerned about the path my son was choosing. In the years following Jennifer's death, I watched from a distance as Thomas worked hard to establish himself. He was talented and dedicated, quickly becoming a valued team member at his firm. But his advancement was slower than it might have been because he hesitated to put himself forward, something I attributed to his naturally modest nature. What Thomas didn't know was that I had begun quietly supporting his career in another way. Through my contacts in construction, I learned about community projects in Boston needing architectural services, senior centers, affordable housing renovations, library expansions, that sort of thing. I would anonymously fund parts of these projects with the stipulation that they consider hiring BKT architects, specifically requesting Thomas as the project lead. This gave him opportunities to build his portfolio while serving the community, something I knew would align with his values. During my occasional visits, I noticed concerning changes in their household dynamics. Sarah's taste for luxury had not diminished with marriage or the birth of Lucas. Their home was furnished with expensive pieces that seemed designed to impress rather than provide comfort. Thomas worked increasingly long hours, while Sarah's employment remained sporadic at best. When I gently inquired about their financial situation, Thomas would become evasive, assuring me everything was fine. By the time they invited me to move in, I already suspected their finances were in worse shape than Thomas admitted. My suspicions were confirmed when I overheard a late-night argument about credit card debt shortly after I arrived. Sarah was insisting they needed to renovate the kitchen with high-end appliances to keep up with her friend's recent remodel. Thomas was trying to explain they simply couldn't afford it right now. "We can put it on the home equity line," Sarah had argued. "The kitchen sells the house, everyone knows that." "We already owe $30,000 on the credit cards," Thomas had replied, his voice tight with stress. "We can't keep borrowing against the future." That conversation revealed the truth. My son, who had been raised to live within his means, was drowning in consumer debt. The mortgage on their house was substantial, and they had already taken out a home equity line of credit to fund previous renovations and vacations. They were essentially living paycheck to paycheck, despite their combined income putting them well above average. My heart ached for Thomas. I recognized in him the same conflict I had seen in many hardworking people over the years. The desire to provide abundantly for their families warring with the practical reality of financial limitations. He wanted to give Sarah and Lucas the life they wanted, even at the cost of his own peace of mind. In those early months living with them, I tried to re-establish the close relationship Thomas and I had once shared. We would sometimes work together on small projects around the house, moments when the strain seemed to leave his face. Lucas adored these times, helping us with his toy tools, absorbing the easy camaraderie between father and grandfather. Thomas would occasionally confide his professional frustrations to me. He had ideas for more sustainable, community-focused design that his firm wasn't pursuing. He dreamed of starting his own practice, but felt trapped by financial obligations. During these conversations, I would offer what wisdom I could without overstepping, planting seeds about living more authentically that I hoped would eventually flower. But I could see Thomas was increasingly caught between his own values and the lifestyle Sarah expected. When he would suggest cutting back on expenses, she would accuse him of not being ambitious enough. When he talked about meaning and purpose in his work, she would counter with examples of classmates who were now designing vacation homes for celebrities or corporate headquarters for tech companies. The Thomas I had raised, who found joy in creating beautiful, functional spaces that served real needs, was being steadily eroded by pressure to chase status and wealth. The tension was taking a visible toll on him. He had developed a nervous habit of checking his phone constantly for work emails, had trouble sleeping, and had put on weight from stress eating. The confident, purposeful young man was fading, replaced by someone perpetually anxious about meeting expectations he hadn't chosen for himself. Despite these concerns, I held back from direct intervention. Thomas was an adult, and these were his choices to make. Jennifer's words echoed in my memory. Don't make it too easy for him, but be there when he really needs you. I wasn't sure if that moment had arrived yet, or what form my help should take when it did. So I continued to observe, to offer support without judgment, and to hope that Thomas would find his way back to the values that once guided him. It didn't take long for Sarah's true feelings about my presence to surface. The polite facade she maintained when Thomas was present disappeared completely when we were alone. What began as subtle sighs of irritation gradually evolved into open hostility. Sarah's expensive tastes extended to every aspect of their lives. She insisted on organic, specialty groceries from high-end markets. Their closets were filled with designer clothes, many still bearing tags. Lucas had more toys than he could possibly play with, the newest electronic gadgets, and a bedroom that looked like it belonged in a luxury catalog rather than a child's actual living space. Every morning, Sarah would spend nearly 2 hours getting ready, emerging from the master bathroom in full makeup and carefully styled hair, even if she had no particular place to go. Image was everything to her, both in person and online. Her social media accounts were carefully curated showcases of their perfect life. Beautifully plated meals, artfully arranged family photos, and regular updates about Thomas's career achievements, often exaggerated for effect. My own simple habits became targets for her criticism. When I made myself a sandwich for lunch, instead of ordering delivery, Sarah would make comments about being cheap. When I wore the same comfortable sweater several days in a row, she would ask if I needed fashion advice. When I chose to read a book in the evening rather than watch the reality shows she preferred, she would sigh dramatically about how boring older people were. At first, I tried to build bridges. I offered to cook traditional dishes from my youth, hoping food might create connection. Sarah would take one bite, declare it interesting, and later, order takeout. I asked about her design projects, genuinely curious about her creative process. She would give vague answers before changing the subject to complaints about clients not appreciating her vision. 3 months after I moved in, I overheard Sarah on the phone with a friend, unaware I had come upstairs to make tea. Living with Thomas's father is such a nightmare, she was saying, her voice dripping with disdain. He shuffles around in those awful slippers, watches the news at full volume, and constantly gives unsolicited advice about money, as if he has any idea what it takes to maintain our lifestyle. Thomas refuses to discuss assisted living facilities yet, says it's too soon. But honestly, how much longer am I expected to play nurse to an old man who contributes nothing? Her words stung, not because they were true, but because they revealed how completely she had misunderstood both my character and my situation. I had never needed their financial support. My hearing was excellent. I maintained my own health with daily walks and regular checkups, and I had deliberately avoided giving financial advice despite seeing multiple red flags in their spending habits. The incident that truly confirmed Sarah's character occurred about 6 months after I moved in. I returned early from a doctor's appointment to find her in my private space, rifling through my desk drawers. She jumped when I cleared my throat from the doorway, quickly making up an excuse about looking for stamps. But I knew exactly what she was doing, searching for financial information. I had noticed my bank statements moved from their usual place, my investment portfolio booklet slightly askew on the shelf. Sarah was trying to determine my net worth, likely to calculate what might eventually come to Thomas, and by extension, to her. Rather than confront her directly, I began taking additional privacy measures. I rented a safe deposit box at the local bank for important documents. I had my financial statements sent to a post office box rather than their home address. I kept only a modest checking account for daily expenses, with the bulk of my assets carefully secured elsewhere. These precautions weren't due to distrust of Thomas, but recognition of Sarah's growing desperation around money. The financial strain in their household was becoming impossible to ignore. Collection agency calls came with increasing frequency. Thomas would take these in his home office, emerging with a tightened jaw and distracted manner. Credit card declined notices arrived in the mail. Twice, I observed Sarah hiding shopping bags in her car trunk before bringing them into the house in small batches, presumably to downplay her spending to Thomas. Meanwhile, Sarah's questions about my finances became more pointed. She would casually ask if I had considered helping out more with household expenses, despite the fact that I already paid rent and covered all grocery shopping. She would mention friends whose parents had given them down payments for houses or paid for luxury vacations, clearly fishing for similar offerings. Once, after several glasses of wine, she directly asked what provisions I had made in my will, a question so inappropriate that even Thomas looked embarrassed. Family dinners, which I had once imagined as warm, multi-generational gatherings, became tense affairs. Sarah would dominate conversation with complaints about work, bragging about connections to wealthy clients, or making thinly veiled criticisms of my presence. Thomas would attempt to steer topics toward neutral ground, growing increasingly uncomfortable as meals progressed. Only Lucas, with his innocent 6-year-old perspective, seemed genuinely happy to have me there, often asking to sit beside Grandpa Eddie and chattering about his day at school. One evening, after a particularly strained dinner where Sarah had made multiple references to the financial burden of maintaining such a large house, Thomas came down to my apartment. His face was drawn with worry as he apologized for his wife's behavior. "Dad, I want you to know that I'm glad you're here," he said, perching awkwardly on my sofa. "Sarah is just. She gets anxious about money sometimes." "Thomas," I said carefully, "are things worse than you've told me? Financially, I mean." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of his childhood that it made my heart ache. "We're managing," he said, but wouldn't meet my eyes. "The economy's been tough on architecture firms. Some projects got delayed. But we'll turn the corner soon." I wanted to tell him then about the $5 million invested, about how I could eliminate their debt with a signature, about how his mother and I had always intended to help him establish himself. But something held me back. Thomas needed to recognize the unsustainability of his current path on his own. Simply bailing them out would solve the immediate problem, but leave the underlying issues intact, perhaps even reinforcing Sarah's belief that financial rescue would always materialize when needed. So instead, I offered what I could without revealing my full hand. "Son, you know I'm here for you. Whatever you need, we're family." He nodded, seemingly relieved I hadn't pressed for details. "I know, Dad. It'll all work out." As he left, I wondered if I was making the right choice by keeping my financial situation private. Was I truly honoring Jennifer's wish to help Thomas establish independence? Or was I allowing pride and principle to stand in the way of practical assistance? These questions troubled me as tensions in the household continued to escalate, pushing us inevitably toward a breaking point none of us could anticipate. As November approached, Sarah began talking incessantly about hosting Thanksgiving dinner. Not just any dinner, but what she called a statement event that would showcase their home to her parents and extended family. This would be the first time her parents, Leonard and Diane Patterson, would be visiting since I had moved in. "Everything needs to be perfect," Sarah declared one evening, spreading glossy home magazine pages across the dining table. "I'm thinking of full table setting with the Wedgwood china, crystal glassware, and fresh floral arrangements. We'll need to rent a larger table to accommodate everyone." Thomas looked up from his laptop where he'd been working late again. "Honey, don't you think that's a bit much? Thanksgiving is about family, not impressing people." Sarah's expression hardened. "My parents expect a certain standard, Thomas. I won't have them thinking we can't afford to entertain properly." The irony of her statement wasn't lost on me, as I knew from Thomas's increasingly frequent late-night pacing that they absolutely couldn't afford what Sarah was planning. 2 days later, I accidentally discovered just how dire things had become when I collected the mail and found an envelope that had slipped from the stack Thomas usually intercepted. It was a notice of pending foreclosure proceedings, giving them 30 days to bring their mortgage current before the bank took further action. I replaced the notice in the mail pile, my heart heavy. That evening, I casually mentioned to Thomas that if he ever needed financial assistance, I had savings I could access. He thanked me but insisted everything was under control. His pride, something I had always admired, was now preventing him from accepting help he desperately needed. Meanwhile, Sarah plunged ahead with Thanksgiving preparations, ordering an expensive heritage turkey from a specialty farm, purchasing new table linens, and hiring professional cleaners to prepare the house. I watched silently as Thomas's expression grew more strained with each new expense, but he continued to acquiesce to Sarah's demands rather than provoke a confrontation. A week before Thanksgiving, I overheard another argument from my apartment below. Sarah was insisting they needed to replace the living room furniture before her parents arrived. Thomas finally pushed back. "We can't put another penny on credit, Sarah. Do you understand that we're already 3 months behind on the mortgage? The bank is threatening foreclosure." "Then get your father to help," Sarah shouted back. "He's living here practically free, using our utilities, eating our food. It's time he contributed something meaningful, instead of hoarding whatever savings he has." "I'm not asking my father for money," Thomas replied, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "He worked hard his whole life. That's his retirement you're talking about." "Retirement from what? Running some small-time construction company in the middle of nowhere. How much could he possibly have saved? If he had any substantial money, he wouldn't be living in our basement." Their argument continued, with Sarah eventually storming out of the house. Later that night, I heard Thomas in the kitchen and went upstairs to find him sitting at the table, head in his hands, a pile of bills spread before him. "Son," I said quietly, sitting across from him, "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about your finances." Thomas looked up, his eyes red-rimmed from stress or tears. I couldn't tell which. "It's bad, Dad. Really bad. I've been trying to keep it together, but we're drowning in debt. The mortgage, credit cards, Sarah's car lease, Lucas's private school tuition, and now I've just found out Sarah took out a second mortgage without telling me. She forged my signature on the paperwork. The revelation stunned me. Thomas, that's fraud." "I know." He rubbed his face wearily. "But what am I supposed to do? Report my wife to the police? The mother of my child?" I could see my son was at a breaking point, and knew the time had come to offer real help. But before I could formulate how to approach this, Thomas continued speaking. "The worst part is, I don't even recognize my life anymore, Dad. This house, these things, this constant pressure to earn more, spend more, appear successful. None of it is what I wanted. I wanted to design buildings that helped people, that solved problems, and served communities. Instead, I'm working on luxury condos for foreign investors who will never even live in them." In that moment, I saw the boy I had raised, the one who had inherited Jennifer's compassionate spirit and my practical nature, fighting to emerge from the false life that had been constructed around him. I resolved then to help Thomas find his way back to himself. But I needed to handle the situation carefully. Simply offering money wouldn't solve the deeper problems. "Thomas," I said, reaching across the table to clasp his shoulder, "after Thanksgiving, let's sit down and work out a plan. I can help more than you know, but first we need to get through this holiday." He nodded, looking slightly relieved just to have shared his burden. "Thanks, Dad. Just don't mention any of this to Sarah right now. She's set on making this Thanksgiving perfect for her parents." The day before Thanksgiving, Sarah's parents arrived. Leonard Patterson was a real estate developer with a perpetual air of evaluating everything and everyone in terms of monetary value. Diane was a former beauty queen who had maintained her appearance through what I suspected were multiple cosmetic procedures. They swept into the house trailing designer luggage, immediately commenting on the neighborhood, up and coming but not quite established. The house, charming, but smaller than we expected, and even Lucas, a bit small for his age, isn't he? Their attitude toward me was cordial but dismissive. Leonard asked what I used to do, emphasizing the past tense as if retirement had rendered me irrelevant. When I explained I had owned a construction company, he nodded with the patronizing air of someone acknowledging a much smaller fish in the pond. "Small business is the backbone of America," he said. in the tone one might use to praise a child's drawing. Not where the real money is, of course, but honorable work. Diane barely acknowledged me at all, too busy critiquing the house with Sarah, pointing out areas that simply must be updated and suggesting brands and designers for various improvements. I caught Thomas's eye during this exchange, seeing the resignation there. These were the in-laws he had been trying to impress for years, people who would never be satisfied because their measuring stick was always shifting higher. The rest of the family began arriving Thanksgiving morning. Thomas's cousin Brian and his wife came with their 2 teenagers. My brother Franklin and his wife Mabel drove up from Connecticut. Franklin was the only person present who knew about my financial situation, having helped me with investment decisions after Jennifer's death. When he saw the tension in the household, he pulled me aside. "Eddie, what the hell is going on here? This place feels like a powder keg ready to blow." I gave him a brief summary of the situation, including Thomas's financial troubles and Sarah's attitude. Franklin shook his head. "Why haven't you told them about the money? You could solve their problems tomorrow." "Money wouldn't solve the real problem," I replied. "Thomas needs to decide what kind of life he actually wants, not just have his current mistakes bailed out." "Well, something's got to give," Franklin observed. "That woman looks at you like you're something she stepped in." As dinner preparations continued, Sarah became increasingly frantic, micromanaging every detail. When I offered to help in the kitchen, she practically pushed me out, saying, "No offense, Eduardo, but we're aiming for a certain standard here." I retreated to help Thomas set up the dining room instead, extending the table and arranging chairs. Sarah had indeed rented expensive table settings, crystal glasses, and silver candelabras that seemed more appropriate for a wedding than a family Thanksgiving. Thomas worked silently, his movements mechanical, a man going through motions that held no joy for him. By 4 o'clock, everything was ready. The table was set elaborately, the turkey was resting, and side dishes filled the warming drawer of their high-end oven. Sarah had changed into an expensive-looking dress, her hair and makeup flawless, as if for a photo shoot. Thomas wore a button-down shirt and slacks, looking uncomfortable in the formal attire. Lucas had been scrubbed clean and dressed in an outfit that made him look like a miniature banker, much to his obvious discomfort. As everyone gathered around the table, I noticed the expensive wine being poured freely, Sarah and her parents consuming glass after glass during appetizers alone. I sipped water, preferring to keep a clear head. Something in the air told me this evening would require all my faculties intact. Leonard proposed a toast to success and prosperity, pointedly ignoring Franklin's attempt to add and family to the sentiment. We were seated, the food was served, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope that perhaps the evening would proceed without incident. But as Leonard began questioning everyone about their work and accomplishments, I could feel the familiar dynamic establishing itself. Success defined purely in terms of money and status, with any other metric dismissed as irrelevant. When Leonard turned his attention to me, asking about my retirement plans, I knew we had reached the moment of truth. The path forward was about to reveal itself, for better or worse. "So, Eduardo," Leonard said, swirling his third glass of wine, "what does retirement look like for someone in your position? Travel? Hobbies? Or just taking it easy?" The question seemed innocent enough, but his tone carried the implication that my options must be limited by modest means. Before I could answer, Sarah jumped in. "Dad, Eduardo is enjoying his golden years right here with us," she said with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We're so blessed to have this multi-generational living situation." I smiled mildly. "I keep pretty busy. I volunteer at the community center twice a week, take some classes at the senior center, and spend time with my grandson." "How economical," Diane commented. "Senior centers offer such wonderful free activities for people on fixed incomes." Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but remained silent, cutting his turkey with unnecessary precision. "Eduardo was just telling me about his construction days," Leonard continued, clearly fishing for financial details. "Small operation, was it?" "We did all right," I replied neutrally. "Employed about 100 people at our peak." Sarah made a small, dismissive noise, Hardly Patterson Development's 500 employees, right, Daddy? Well, not everyone can build on that scale, Leonard agreed magnanimously. The capital requirements alone would be prohibitive for most small contractors. I noticed Franklin suppressing a smile across the table, the only person present who knew the truth about my finances. Speaking of capital, Sarah said, her voice taking on an edge as she turned to Thomas. We should tell everyone about your promotion prospects, honey. The senior partner position that's opening up next year? Thomas looked startled. That's not exactly. I mean, my name might be considered, but there are several associates with more seniority. But none with your talent, Sarah insisted. And if you just meet with the clients I suggested, the ones from my charity committee, you could bring in the kind of high-end residential projects the partners notice. Sarah, we've discussed this, Thomas said quietly. I'm more interested in the public works division, the library renovation and community center projects. Sarah rolled her eyes dramatically. Those budget projects won't advance your career, Thomas. We need to think bigger. Not everything is about money, Sarah, Thomas replied, a rare note of defiance in his voice. The table fell silent. Even Lucas seemed to sense the tension. His small fork paused midway to his mouth. Sarah's face flushed. Whether from the wine or anger, I couldn't tell. That's easy for you to say when you're not the one trying to maintain our lifestyle while supporting your father, too. And there it was, the first direct shot across the bow. I maintained my neutral expression, curious to see how Thomas would respond. Dad pays rent, Sarah, Thomas said, his voice tight. And he contributes in plenty of other ways. Rent? Sarah laughed sharply. That token amount barely covers his utilities, let alone the space he occupies or the food he eats. Let's be honest about who's carrying the financial burden in this house. Leonard nodded in agreement. It's a valid point, Thomas. The sandwich generation gets squeezed from both directions, supporting children and aging parents simultaneously. I could see Thomas struggling with how to respond without revealing the extent of their financial troubles to the entire table. Before he could formulate an answer, Sarah continued, her filter apparently dissolved by wine and frustration. If Eduardo had planned better for retirement, maybe you wouldn't be working 60-hour weeks just to stay afloat, she said, gesturing with her wine glass. Some parents actually help their children succeed instead of becoming dependents. Franklin set down his fork with a deliberate movement. Now wait just a minute, he began. But I caught his eye and gave a small shake of my head. This was between Thomas, Sarah, and me. Sarah, Thomas said, warning in his voice. This isn't the time or place. When is the time, Thomas? When we lose the house. When Lucas has to change schools because we can't afford tuition. Sarah's voice was rising. Meanwhile, your father sits in our basement, contributing nothing but folksy wisdom while we drown in expenses. The table had gone completely silent now, everyone frozen in the uncomfortable tableau of a family argument laid bare before guests. Even Sarah's parents looked uncomfortable with how explicit their daughter's complaints had become. Thomas pushed back his chair slightly. Sarah, that's enough. No, it's not enough. Sarah's control was fully gone now, her frustration finding its target in me. You know what would be enough? If your father actually helped instead of being a burden. If he got a job, did something useful instead of puttering around our house all day. He's 72 years old, Thomas protested. So? Plenty of seniors work part-time. Walmart greeter, grocery bagger, something to contribute to this household instead of just taking. Thomas stood up now, his face flushed with anger. Stop it, Sarah, right now. But Sarah was too far gone. The months of resentment boiling over in a public spectacle she would likely regret when sober. She pointed at me accusingly, her voice rising to nearly a shout. Get a job and stop being a leech, she yelled, the words echoing in the sudden silence of the dining room. Everyone froze. Lucas's eyes went wide with shock. Thomas looked mortified. Sarah's parents stared at their plates. My brother Franklin half rose from his chair, protective instinct kicking in. And I burst out laughing. It wasn't planned or strategic. The sheer absurdity of the moment simply struck me all at once. This woman, who had no idea who I really was or what resources I commanded, was calling me a leech. The construction company owner who had employed hundreds, paid millions in taxes over decades, and who could buy and sell her parents' supposed fortune several times over, was being told to get a job bagging groceries. My laughter rang out in the silent dining room, genuine and unrestrained. Everyone stared at me in confusion, none more so than Sarah, whose righteous anger faltered in the face of this unexpected reaction. "What's so funny?" she demanded. But her voice had lost its edge, uncertainty creeping in. I took a moment to compose myself, dabbing at my eyes with my napkin. "I'm sorry," I said finally. "It's just not often I get called a leech by someone who has no idea who I am." "What is that supposed to mean?" Sarah asked, a note of defensiveness replacing her previous confidence. I looked at Thomas, seeing the confusion in his eyes. "Son, I think it's time I clarified a few things about my financial situation." Thomas frowned slightly. "Dad, you don't need to explain anything. Actually, I do." I turned back to Sarah, my voice calm but firm. "Sarah, when I sold my construction company 10 years ago, it was valued at just over $5 million. I've lived off the investment income ever since, while maintaining the same modest lifestyle I always had. I moved in here not because I needed a place to stay, but because Thomas asked me to, and because I wanted to be close to my grandson." Sarah's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing without sound. "Furthermore," I continued, "I've been aware of your financial difficulties for some time now. The late notices, the collection calls, the second mortgage you took out without Thomas's knowledge." Sarah shot an accusatory look at Thomas, who shook his head. "He figured it out on his own, Sarah. Dad sees more than you give him credit for." I reached for my water glass, taking a sip before continuing. "I had planned to help you both after the holidays, to sit down and work out a long-term solution. But given tonight's display, I think immediate action is required." I turned to address Sarah directly, keeping my voice even. "Sweetheart, find yourself a new place to live." The silence that followed was absolute. Even Lucas seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, his small face solemn as he looked between the adults. Sarah recovered first, her shock giving way to damage control. "Eduardo, clearly I've had too much wine. I didn't mean what I said. We all get frustrated sometimes, say things we don't mean." "I meant what I said," I replied calmly. "This house is not actually yours to invite me to leave. 3 months ago, when I discovered you were facing foreclosure, I contacted the bank and purchased the mortgage outright. I own this house, free and clear." Thomas stared at me in disbelief. "Dad, what are you saying?" "I'm saying," I continued, looking at my son with compassion, "that you and Lucas have a home for as long as you want one. Sarah, however, has some decisions to make about her future living arrangements." Sarah looked to her parents for support, but they were suddenly very interested in their plate settings, unwilling to engage now that the power dynamic had shifted so dramatically. "You can't just throw me out," Sarah protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "I'm Thomas's wife. This is my home too." "Actually," I said, "Massachusetts law is quite clear about property rights. As the sole owner, I can determine who lives here. I'm not throwing you out tonight, of course. I'm not heartless. You have 30 days to make arrangements, which is more consideration than you've shown me during my time here." Thomas looked torn between shock at my revelations and relief that someone was finally taking control of the spiraling situation. "Dad, maybe we should discuss this privately," he suggested. "I think we're past that point, Thomas," I replied gently. "Some things need to be said plainly, and I believe this is one of those times." I turned back to the table at large. "I apologize to everyone for this disruption to our Thanksgiving dinner. This isn't how I wanted the evening to go. But perhaps it's better to have truth on the table than turkey." Franklin broke the tension with a short laugh. "Well said, brother." He raised his glass. "To truth, however uncomfortable it might be." Leonard and Diane exchanged glances, then suddenly remembered pressing engagements elsewhere. Within minutes, they had made their excuses and departed, leaving their daughter to face the consequences of her actions without their support. The cowardice didn't surprise me. People who base relationships on status and money rarely stand firm when those elements shift. The remainder of the evening passed in awkward conversation and early departures. By 8 o'clock, only the immediate family remained: Thomas, Sarah, Lucas, and myself. Lucas had been sent to his room with dessert and his tablet, shielded from the adult discussions that needed to happen. Sarah sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa, her perfect makeup now smeared from crying, her posture defensive. Thomas paced the living room, periodically running his hands through his hair in a gesture of disbelief, and I waited, knowing that the initial shock would need to settle before any productive conversation could occur. The confrontation had happened. The truth was out. Now came the hard part: determining what kind of family would emerge from the wreckage of facades and false expectations. The days following Thanksgiving unfolded in a haze of tense conversations and emotional revelations. Sarah spent the first night at a hotel, returning the next day with red-rimmed eyes and a chastened demeanor. Thomas oscillated between anger at being kept in the dark about my finances and relief that their immediate financial crisis had an escape route. The morning after Thanksgiving, while Sarah was still at the hotel, I sat down with Thomas for a long, overdue conversation. We took our coffee to my apartment in the basement, away from Lucas's curious ears. "Why didn't you tell me?" Thomas asked, his voice containing equal parts hurt and bewilderment. "All this time, watching us struggle, why keep your financial situation secret?" I considered my answer carefully. "Partly out of habit. Your mother and I never discussed money outside the family, and after she passed, that circle got even smaller. Partly out of respect for your independence. We raised you to make your own way, and I didn't want to interfere with that process. But you watched us drowning, Dad." Thomas's voice cracked slightly. The debt, the stress, Sarah's spending. "You saw it all and said nothing. Would you have accepted help if I'd offered it directly?" I asked gently. Thomas was silent for a moment, then shook his head reluctantly. "Probably not. At least, not until recently. I was so determined to handle everything myself, to prove I could provide the lifestyle Sarah wanted. And that's the real issue, isn't it?" I said. "Not the money itself, but what you've been trying to prove, and to whom." Thomas stared into his coffee cup. "I don't even know anymore. Somewhere along the way I lost track of what I actually wanted versus what I thought I was supposed to want. The house, the car, the private school. None of it feels like me, Dad. It feels like I've been living someone else's life. Your mother worried about that," I said quietly. "Not that you wouldn't be successful, but that you might define success by others' standards rather than your own." "I miss her," Thomas said, his voice small. "She would have seen through all this years ago." "She would have," I agreed. "But she also believed you needed to find your own path. That's why she made me promise not to make things too easy for you, but to be there when you really needed me. And you think that time is now? I think you've been drowning for a while, son. I just needed to be sure you were ready to grab the lifeline." Thomas looked up, meeting my eyes directly. "So what happens now? With the house? With Sarah? With everything?" "That depends largely on you," I replied. "The house is secure. I've paid off both mortgages. What you need to decide is what kind of life you want moving forward, and whether Sarah shares that vision." Thomas ran a hand over his face. "She's Lucas's mother. I can't just—" "No one's suggesting you abandon your family," I assured him. "But there's a difference between supporting your family and enabling destructive behavior. Sarah has choices to make, too, about her priorities and values." Over the next several hours, Thomas and I had the most honest conversation we'd shared in years. He confessed the full extent of their financial troubles: nearly $70,000 in credit card debt, the fraudulent second mortgage, missed car payments, and several personal loans from Sarah's friends that had strained those relationships. More painful than the financial confessions were the emotional ones. Thomas admitted he had fallen out of love with Sarah years ago but had stayed out of commitment to Lucas and fear of failure. He described how her constant criticism had eroded his confidence, how her dismissal of his professional interests had pushed him away from work he found meaningful, and how isolated he had become from friends who didn't fit Sarah's image of success. The worst part, he said, his voice hollow, is that I don't think she ever loved me for myself. She loved the potential she saw, the successful architect she could mold me into, the lifestyle she thought I could provide. But me, the real Thomas Williams who likes hiking and reading history books and designing affordable housing, I don't think she even sees that person. By evening, Sarah had returned, and the three of us sat down for another difficult conversation. To her credit, she seemed genuinely remorseful about her Thanksgiving outburst, though I suspected her contrition was influenced by the revelation of my financial status. Nevertheless, I approached the discussion with an open mind. I want to apologize for what I said, Sarah began, her voice carefully modulated. It was inexcusable, and I'm truly sorry, Eduardo. I nodded my acceptance of her apology but waited for more. Sarah fidgeted under my gaze. About the living arrangements, she continued. I understand you own the house now, but surely there's no need for drastic changes. We're family, after all. Sarah, Thomas interjected before I could respond. I think we need to be honest about the state of our marriage. It hasn't been working for a long time. Sarah's carefully composed expression faltered. We've been under financial stress, that's all. Every couple goes through rough patches. It's more than that, Thomas said firmly. We want fundamentally different things. I've been trying to be someone I'm not to make you happy, and it's destroying me. Is this about your father's money? Sarah asked, a defensive edge creeping into her voice. Because now that we know he can help, our financial problems are solved. That's exactly the problem, Thomas replied. You see his money as the solution, not as a chance for us to reevaluate our priorities and make real changes. The conversation continued in this vein for hours, moving from denial to anger to bargaining. Sarah promised to change, to spend less, to support Thomas's career choices. But with each promise, it became clearer that she saw these as temporary concessions to weather a crisis, not as permanent lifestyle changes. At one point, she turned to me directly. Eduardo, surely you don't want Lucas growing up in a broken home. As a grandfather, don't you want to protect your grandson's family? It was a calculated appeal, but I had anticipated it. What I want for Lucas, I replied calmly, is to grow up with honest values and parents who are true to themselves, whether together or apart. Children are perceptive, Sarah. They sense unhappiness and tension, and it affects them more deeply than a straightforward transition to a new family structure. By midnight, we had reached an impasse. Sarah reluctantly agreed to look for an apartment, with my offer to cover the first 6 months' rent as she established herself independently. Thomas would remain in the house with Lucas, with a custody arrangement to be determined once both households were settled. As Sarah went upstairs to check on Lucas, Thomas turned to me with exhaustion etched on his face. Do you think I'm doing the right thing? Breaking up our family? I think you're being honest for the first time in years, I replied. That's always the right thing, even when it's painful. The following weeks were a blur of activity and emotion. Sarah found a 2-bedroom apartment in a nearby neighborhood, allowing Lucas to maintain his school and social connections. Thomas began the process of disentangling their finances, a task made easier by my assistance but still fraught with emotional landmines. Throughout this period, I was careful to support without controlling. When Thomas asked for help navigating the separation, I connected him with a good family law attorney. When he expressed anxiety about Lucas's adjustment, I helped research child psychologists who specialized in divorce situations. When he worried about Sarah's financial stability, I helped structure a fair support arrangement that provided security without enabling further irresponsible spending. Sarah's reaction to the separation evolved in stages. Initially, she alternated between tearful pleas for reconciliation and angry accusations of abandonment. When these tactics failed to change Thomas's resolve, she attempted to use Lucas as leverage, suggesting that a court would never grant Thomas primary custody given his work schedule. This approach backfired when Thomas, with my encouragement, reduced his hours at the firm to spend more time with his son, demonstrating his commitment to parenting. Finally, about 6 weeks after Thanksgiving, Sarah seemed to accept the inevitability of the separation. During a surprisingly civil discussion about dividing their possessions, she made an observation that suggested a glimmer of self-awareness. "I think I wanted the lifestyle more than the marriage," she admitted quietly, running her fingers over an expensive vase she had once insisted they needed. The house, the address, the right schools and vacations and dinner parties. Somewhere along the way, those things became more important than how we felt about each other. Thomas nodded, neither accusatory nor defensive. "I wanted to give you those things because I thought they would make you happy. But they never did, not really." "No," Sarah agreed, a rare moment of candor between them. "They just made me want more." By early January, the practical aspects of the separation were largely settled. Sarah had moved into her apartment, taking the furniture and decorative items she most valued. Lucas was adjusting to the new arrangement with the resilience children often show when freed from the tension of an unhappy household. Thomas had filed for divorce, a process Sarah wasn't contesting as vigorously as initially threatened. One evening, as Thomas and I sat in the newly rearranged living room after Lucas had gone to bed, my son looked more relaxed than I had seen him in years. The constant worry line between his eyebrows had faded, and his movements had lost their nervous energy. "You know," he said, glancing around at the now simpler space, "I haven't used my credit card once since Thanksgiving. Not a single purchase." "How does that feel?" I asked. "Liberating," Thomas replied with a small smile. "Like I've put down a heavy backpack I didn't even realize I was carrying." As winter deepened outside, a sense of thawing and renewal spread within our household. Thomas began to rediscover interests and friendships he had neglected during his marriage. He spoke more confidently about his professional aspirations, including his dream of starting a firm focused on sustainable community design. And most importantly, his relationship with Lucas blossomed in the hours they spent together, no longer overshadowed by marital tension or financial stress. The confrontation had indeed been painful, the aftermath challenging. But watching my son emerge from the wreckage of false expectations into a more authentic life, I knew that Jennifer would have approved of how things had unfolded. The breaking had been necessary for true healing to begin. 6 months after that fateful Thanksgiving dinner, the landscape of our lives had transformed in ways I could scarcely have imagined. Spring had arrived in Boston, bringing with it not just physical renewal, but a sense of emotional rebirth as well. Thomas and I had settled into a comfortable routine in the house, which now felt like a true home rather than a showcase. We had donated or sold much of the expensive furniture and decorative items Sarah had accumulated, replacing them with pieces that were functional, comfortable, and meaningful. Thomas's architectural drawings hung on the walls alongside Lucas's colorful artwork. Bookshelves once filled with design magazines now held history books, novels, and the Lego creations Lucas and his father built together on weekend mornings. The divorce proceedings had moved forward with less acrimony than expected. Sarah, perhaps recognizing the futility of fighting the inevitable, had become more reasonable in her demands and expectations. The final agreement gave them joint custody of Lucas, with Thomas having primary physical custody and Sarah having regular visitation. Child support was fair, but not excessive, allowing Sarah to maintain a comfortable life without enabling the extravagance that had contributed to their marital problems. One unexpected development was Sarah's own growth during this period. Without the pressure of maintaining appearances in an affluent suburb, she had finally secured consistent work with a commercial design firm and seemed to be developing a more grounded perspective on what truly mattered. Her relationship with Lucas remained strong, and she had begun attending co-parenting counseling with Thomas, a suggestion that would have been rejected outright months earlier. Thomas had made even more dramatic changes. After careful consideration and numerous discussions with me, he had resigned from his position at the architectural firm where he had worked for years. The decision wasn't made lightly, but he had become increasingly certain that his professional path needed to align more closely with his personal values. "I don't want Lucas to see me spending my life doing work that doesn't fulfill me," he explained the day he gave notice. "What kind of example would that set?" With my financial backing and mentorship, Thomas established Williams Design Group, a small architectural practice focused on affordable housing, community spaces, and sustainable design. Rather than leasing expensive office space, he converted the formal dining room we rarely used into a functional home office, complete with drafting table and meeting area for clients. The early months were challenging. As any new business venture island, there were weeks of uncertainty, moments of self-doubt, and the inevitable learning curve of entrepreneurship. But Thomas approached these challenges with a newfound resilience and clarity of purpose. Each problem was faced directly, rather than avoided. Each decision made with awareness of his true priorities, rather than external expectations. I took care to support without controlling, offering advice when asked but respecting Thomas's authority over his own business. When he secured his first major project, designing a mixed-use development with affordable housing units, the pride in his voice when he called to tell me made my heart swell. This wasn't just professional success, it was alignment between his work and his deepest values. My own role had evolved as well. Rather than the burdensome dependent Sarah had perceived, I became an active partner in both household and business matters. I managed the renovation of our basement apartment into a proper guest suite, giving me more privacy while freeing the main floor for family use. I established a regular schedule caring for Lucas after school 3 days a week, allowing Thomas to schedule client meetings without worrying about childcare. Most significantly, I gradually revealed to Thomas the extent of my philanthropic work over the years. The anonymous donations, the community projects I had quietly funded, the scholarships established in Jennifer's name. These activities had given purpose to my retirement years, a way of extending the values Jennifer and I had shared throughout our marriage. Thomas was initially surprised by the scope of these efforts. "You never talked about any of this," he remarked one evening as we reviewed the portfolio of projects. "Your mother and I believed giving should be done quietly," I explained. "The impact matters more than the recognition." This revelation led to our most meaningful collaboration yet. The establishment of the Jennifer Williams Foundation, dedicated to funding community development projects with a focus on affordable housing and educational facilities. Thomas would provide architectural expertise and connections, while I would contribute financial resources and business acumen. Together, we could amplify the impact of my previous individual efforts. As spring turned to summer, Lucas completed first grade with improved confidence and academic performance. The tension that had affected his concentration during the marriage had dissipated, and his natural curiosity and creativity flourished in the more stable environment. Watching him race through the sprinkler in our backyard, his laughter carrying on the warm air, I thought of how Jennifer would have delighted in his uninhibited joy. One evening in July, as Thomas and I sat on the back porch, watching fireflies appear in the gathering dusk, he turned to me with an expression of peaceful contemplation. "You know what I've been thinking about lately?" he asked. "How wealth is about so much more than money." I nodded, encouraging him to continue. All those years with Sarah, chasing financial success, I felt poorer than I ever have in my life, constantly stressed, constantly lacking, constantly afraid of losing what we had. Now, with objectively less income but more purpose and peace, I feel wealthy in ways I never imagined. "Your mother used to say something similar," I told him. "That true wealth is having enough to share and the wisdom to know what enough means for you." Thomas smiled at the memory of Jennifer's wisdom. "I wish she could see Lucas growing up, see what we're building with the foundation." "She sees," I said simply. "And she would be proud of the man you've become, especially in these past months." The conversation turned to more practical matters, but the sentiment lingered in the warm evening air. We had all been through a painful upheaval, Yet from that breaking had come healing and growth that might otherwise have been impossible. 2 weeks later, Thomas mentioned casually that he had been talking with a woman he met through a community development project, a pediatric nurse named Abigail, who volunteered with the same organization. Unlike his whirlwind courtship with Sarah, this relationship was developing slowly and thoughtfully, based on shared values and genuine connection rather than surface attraction or status considerations. "I'm not rushing into anything," Thomas assured me. "But it's nice to remember that connection is possible with someone who values the same things I do." By the 1-year anniversary of that confrontational Thanksgiving dinner, our lives had transformed almost beyond recognition. Thomas's business was established and growing steadily, focusing on projects that contributed meaningfully to the community. Lucas was thriving in the stable, loving environment his parents had created, despite their separation. Even Sarah had found a healthier path, her relationship with Thomas evolving into a respectful co-parenting partnership. As for me, watching my son reclaim his authentic self and purpose had been the greatest gift of my later years. The money that had remained secret for so long had finally served its true purpose, not to create dependency or enable poor choices, but to provide a foundation from which Thomas could build a life aligned with his values and pass those values on to his son. The lesson I take from this chapter of our family story is not about money at all, but about authenticity and courage. The courage to live according to your true values, even when those around you pressure you to conform to theirs. The courage to acknowledge when a situation has become harmful, even when changing it requires pain and upheaval. And perhaps most importantly, the courage to be honest about who you are, what you have to offer, and what you need from others. Looking back on that moment when Sarah shouted those words across the Thanksgiving table, I can almost feel grateful for her outburst. Sometimes it takes a dramatic breaking point to clear away pretense and begin building something genuine, like a forest fire that, while destructive, creates the conditions for new growth. Our family confrontation burned away years of accumulated falsehoods and created space for truth to flourish. If there's one thing I've learned in my 73 years on this earth, it's that real wealth isn't measured in dollars but in alignment, in the harmony between who you are and how you live. Have you experienced a moment when someone completely misjudged your worth, only to discover later that true value lies beyond appearances? Share your story in the comments below. And if this journey of rediscovering authentic values resonated with you, please subscribe to hear more reflections from this old man who's still learning life's lessons. Thank you for listening. And remember, it's never too late to realign your life with your truest self.